mysterious South Korean market.
Korean VCs tends not to take risks.
Fintech also has a potential in Korea.
If you're a fintech startup that has those kind of diversity, Korea is the market where you can spread out to Asian market.
And speaking about market entry.
In the early stage of marketing, you could use Google marketing. You should definitely have a YouTube channel.
What is the chance for foreign startup to obtain this government funding?
We do have some stereotypes about startups and SMEs in Korea.
And speaking about the myths about Korean markets.
Well, I should feel shame about this. Please don't wear like a Silicon Valley style.
To get drunk with Korean investor.
Korean culture is very shy. They're not really open.
What kind of startups should enter Korean market? Good day to everyone. This is InnMind channel with the best first-hand information for startup founders and tech entrepreneurs. And today we want to talk about bridges between different markets. And we invited an amazing guest who is deep expert in the South Korean startup ecosystem, advisor, mentor, CEO and founder of the terminal agency, startup agency that supports startups, Riso. Hi, Riso.
Hello, Nelly. Nice to see you again.
Thank you for being with us today and sharing your knowledge and insights. You can tell a lot about South Korean startup ecosystem, but can we start with a brief self-introduction of your background?
Terminal has been established in 2019. Before that, we were trying to launch our own startup, but we have found out many errors within the South Korean startup ecosystems. To change that, we started off from a startup agency and a consultancy for foreign startups to come over those challenges. And now we are operating as a consultant and an agent for South Korean startups and international startups.
Amazing. So you are the right person to dig into the Korean startup ecosystem and to help international startups to understand how to enter South Korean market.
Sure.
South Korea is very rapidly developing economy, even despite all the crazy financial crisis and a lockdown crisis. And I just recently talked with a number of startups from InnMind ecosystem that are based mostly in Europe and very much interested to enter Korean market. But they said that they have no clue how even to start doing it because they have no data about Korean market specifics, etc. So what would be your advice on how to start preparing to enter the Korean market?
First of all, one of the reasons that it is so difficult to get South Korean startup ecosystem information is because South Korea is one of the countries that uses own search engine, which is called Naver. And it's all made in Korean, so which is also difficult for you to read. So it's going to be very tough to find that information in Google. But I can suggest you one of the startup that I'm consulting, which is writing about those kind of informations in South Korean startup ecosystems and data. But okay, when you are coming in, most important thing is probably, well, definitely having a good local partner. Whenever I get to discuss these kind of issues with foreign startup leaders in Korean startup ecosystem, the biggest trouble they have gone through was finding a good local partner. So if they had a good local partner, they might have settled much more easier. Tax issues must have been much more easier. Cost must have been decreased in many ways. Other thing, easy way to enter into South Korean market is leveraging the government program. Korean ecosystem has been led by the government for the last decade. It was very strongly led. So most of the startups has been increased just depending on the government ecosystem. So Korean government also runs a startup program for foreign entrepreneurs, which is called Korean Startup Grand Challenge, KSGC. You can easily find it on Google. They offer you visa programs, internship for your startups, also funding for your working in Korea, free co-working spaces, informations, B2B matchings is pretty good. But at the same time, it also has its limitations. So you might have to consider it a lot with your local partner. Yes.
Oh, thank you for pointing this out. So I think that to make it more convenient, we will put in the description of the video the links to this government program and also the startup you advertised. What kind of other challenges faced by foreign startups when they enter Korean market?
Korean laws are very conservative. Korean VC markets are also very conservative. So if you were imagining about Silicon Valley or European startup ecosystem and coming into Korea, you might get to challenge lots of legal barriers to enter in. For example, Uber had lots of difficulty about these legal issues. Many of European and North American laws tend to choose a positive approach, but South Korean law chooses negative approach, which means if it's not written on law, you're not allowed to do it. So government is actually trying to solve these kind of problems with organization called Sandbox, but it's not working really well, because innovation often has to overcome pre-existing groups and parties, associations. So Uber has been having some disputes with labor union of taxi drivers or legal issues in Korea. So they had to change their business model in Korea, which took lots of cost. So if they had much more preliminary research or analysis with their local partner, these kind of issues might have been hatched with much more easier. There are other things like not only legal issues, VCs, venture capital market in Korea is very interesting. When we think about venture capitalists, it's about ventures and the risk they take and the higher returns they get from the success. But in Korea, Korean VCs tends not to take risks. So most of them, probably 90% to 99% of the VCs in Korea are more like a fund managers, not really a venture capitalist. So they tend to invest more on the pre-IPO levels. The most of the seed level investment are done by government or angels. Even angels is very rare to find. Accelerator is very rare to find, also seed level investments. And there's the thing, each VC companies has their own brand. So let's say a VC company is really good at investing on biochemical startups. And if a VC company invests on biochemical startup, other VCs runs into it. But let's say the VC company has a really bad investment rates and their successes cases, then if the company invests on some kind of startup, nobody invests in it. So these kind of psychological issues also occur. And yeah, like these kind of things, you might want to be very cautious before you come into Korea. One more thing would be, there are lots of blockchain startups around the world. But in Korea, there was huge boom among VCs about this blockchain startups about 3 to 4 years ago. And there were also lots of schemes. So nowadays, these VC companies are very cautious and careful on investing on blockchain companies. So it is very difficult market to come into.
So number one, be careful about VCs funding, because most probably in Korea it is even more difficult to raise VC money on early seed, pre-seed, and maybe even A stage than in other countries in the world. Second, don't go with blockchain startup to Korean market, because the hype is over, correct? And nobody right now is interested in investing in it.
Well, it's like I'm not saying blockchain companies need not to come into Korea. Is there opportunity to come into Korea and the other way around? Because that means there are not much of a very affirmative blockchain startups within Korea. So if you have a really good blockchain business model, really good blockchain technologies, it's your opportunity to come into Korea, because one way or another, Korea always goes for the hot tech trend. Right now, these kind of AI and blockchain specialists in Korea, even though they're ranked one in Korean industry, they're probably outside 1,000 or 5,000 rank in global standard. So this is your opportunity to come in, as long as you're not considering such amount of like Series B level of investments. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And can you then tell a little bit more on what kind of startups should enter Korean market? I mean, we know perfectly that Korea is famous for the beauty startups, healthcare startups, and also a lot of cybersecurity and media tech. But what kind of foreign startups and technologies would be most demanded on the Korean market?
Right now in Korea, healthcare startups and industrial technology startup, tech-based startups are actually well respected. So that's the government's tendency to grow within Korean ecosystem. But if you look over the unicorns within Korea, most of them are platforms. So well developed, well based, with a really good team of marketing. Platform business may be also very viable in Korean market. Again, AI is a rising star in a startup ecosystem, but we don't have a really proper AI. Even Samsung cannot figure out what proper AI is working. So if you are a really good AI company, then Korean ecosystem would open their arms wide open. So this could be a huge opportunity. Beauty and fashion, well, it's going to be way too competitive to survive in Korean ecosystem if it's beauty or fashion, because there are so many talented beauty fashion startups in Korea. There's so many. So Nivea, L'Oreal, they're all investing in Korean ecosystem to find out the best gems out of the market. That's how competitive and well developed already. If you want to have comparative advantage, it should be much more tech-based, especially in the healthcare and bio or industrial technologies, in IoT or healthcare. Yeah.
Okay, then, and also recently we discussed with you about fintech startups, and you mentioned that, for example, neobanks and modern payment methods are not so much advanced in Korea yet, correct? So fintech also has a potential in Korea.
Yes, I believe fintech has lots of potential. Many institutes and private banks are interested in this fintech development. But as I told you, regulation is a huge challenge to overcome. There has been some few successful fintech companies in Korea. It worked really well. They were way too monumental that other fintech startups are not that really looking good to us, but actually they're working pretty well. And government's tendency is also trying to grow these fintech startups. But as I said before, according with the language issue, it goes the same. So Korean fintech startups only has advantage within the local market. So it has lack of diversities. So if you're a fintech startup that has those kind of diversity, Korea is the market where you can spread out to Asian market and you can appeal your diversity to the local market.
So Korea can be a trampoline when you are going to penetrate the Asian market at all. I mean, the first step before entering to Chinese market and all the Asian market, correct?
Yes, Korea has a huge number of tourism from these Asian markets, let's say Vietnam, Japan, China, also Americans. So if you are trying to brand it as a global item, Korea is a really good place. Also, it's a really good place for testing and redeveloping your product because Korean customers are very sensitive. So they find even the smallest flaw of your product or service. So you can redevelop it and make it as a better product. You can success in Korea and you can go abroad. Yes.
Mm-hmm. You told a very interesting thing about the demanded technologies, especially artificial intelligence. We have a lot of startups working with IE for B2B sector, for example. So just taking this as an example, or what should they do? For example, we have an artificial intelligence startup for B2B sector, which is already on A stage and scaling up and wants to enter new markets, considering Korea in particular. What should they start from? You advised her to find the local partner, but how to do it, given that even Uber, in your example, could not manage finding the right partner?
Okay, first of all, again, I would say you should find a good local partner. To find a good local partner, easiest way is to come to me.
We will put the link to your expert profile just in the description. So without jokes, guys, please reach out to Riso and he will be glad to help you.
So there is this blockchain-based ERP startup, which is really good. Their technology was very fascinating because they were going through entire supply chain ERP system, which is a one-way platform. It has whole thing within. So I was very interested. But when I was consulting them and I was reaching out to the other this factory markets, these were what they were telling me. It's a really good technology. It's a really good technology. We've been offered with these kind of technologies. This would be cost effective. This would reduce so many injuries or accidents. But our labor union is gonna outrageous. It's gonna be outrageous. So because of the labor union issue, we couldn't have infiltrated or have any contracts with them. Not only labor union issues, even though it's a really good technology, there is always a competitor with less technology developments and details, but they usually win because of the relationship, pre-existing relationship before the negotiations. So when you're looking for partners, you should be looking for partners either way, who is really passionate and ambitious and hardworking, or someone who retired but has really good connections within the local market. Right now, it will be the really good chance because there are lots of well-connected former CEOs or executives of conglomerates retiring. So we had a baby boomer generation who are retiring out of the market. So it will be easy to fetch. Also, we're having lots of crisis on employment market. So it will be also easier for you to find a hardworking, ambitious, passionate partner within Korean market.
But how to find them? I mean, can we use LinkedIn, for example, to reach out to people, experts in Korea, or you have some local platforms where foreigners can find partners or maybe freelancers?
Okay, about the LinkedIn first. In Korea, LinkedIn is not considered as a place for networking. It's more about moving your job. So lots of employees tend not to use LinkedIn. And even though they are using LinkedIn, they're not as active as other countries because you can be considered as a someone who wants to move their job in their company. So it's really sensitive. So LinkedIn may not be a really good option, but you can either use Facebook or Instagram, maybe. That could be one of the way, or join in Korean government programs online or offline, but usually offline. So when you're joining in these kind of programs, it usually provides the visa issues and also gives you money for staying. So that can be a shot you can use. Um, Other thing is there's this platform for team building, BeginMate, where you can find out the potential partners. So this year, the CEO of BeginMate has told me that they're going to redevelop BeginMate into much more complicated platform so they can build up the teams in the seed level to the Series A level, which is much more efficient. So yeah, that platform can be also usable, but the thing is, as I know, BeginMate won't have Korean service. So maybe you can get some help from Korean friends in Facebook or Instagram who can speak English or your language, or any Korean friends around you to do instead of you. Yes.
That's interesting. So Facebook and Instagram are really actively used in Korea as networking tools. And instead of going in LinkedIn, as we do it in Europe, where Facebook is actually used only as a private network of friends and family members. And very rarely I see professionals using Facebook in Europe for networking or business purposes. In comparison with that, in Korea, you can use Facebook and Instagram in more consistent way for business relationship.
You can also use it in that way, but it would be very difficult anyway, because Korean culture is very shy. They're not really open to a random approach from outside. So you would need help. I'm open for helping out. So just let me know. It doesn't need to be Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn. You can always find a friend easy ways. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about, again, market entry, for example, you mentioned platforms are booming in South Korea, and we also have a lot of marketplaces, e-commerce platforms, etc. Many of them think that to penetrate the new market, especially Asian market, similar like South Korean, you need to make the localization, like translating the interface and everything to the Korean language, and then the business will flow, of course, with some amount of paid advertisement. Is it true, or in reality, you can't market, for example, European or American e-commerce shop, e-commerce website in Korea just with translation and advertisement in Google?
That could be a way to approach Korean market. But since we have such many platforms, in the early stage of marketing, you could use Google marketing. You should definitely have a YouTube channel. But you can also, as a pilot test, hop onto pre-existing platforms and start to develop your notability within the market. First of all, translation, it's one thing that you have to overcome, like it or not. But once you do it, you might be expecting much better, how should I say, notability effects, because one of the reasons the Korean market is so difficult is because Korean people are very sensitive to trend, new technologies, but at the same time, they have a very customized needs. So each companies, even though it's a very small company, they can actually take in lots of revenue just because of those kind of customized needs. So if you have some kind of specific features, specific tools or products that you can offer, then if you translate them into Korean and market it in Korea, it would be worthwhile investment. But easy way and most cost-effective way is signing off a wholesalership or pilot testing through a crowdfunding platform in Korea with local partner and start the wholesalership, which would be zero risk for you. You don't need to invest anything because the wholesaler has to pay for the wholesaler prices. And also you can spread your brand first. And then later on, you can negotiate the terms and you can set up the headquarter and you can give better offer to the wholesalers that you've been working with for localizing of your brands.
Sounds like a good plan. And speaking about these contacts with wholesalers and other partners, you mentioned that Koreans are very humble and shy, and it is not easy to just reach out in Facebook and say, hey, I'm doing this, can we collaborate and jump on in a call? So what is your advice specifically on how to communicate?
Working in Korea, I had to be very creative. I had to, I had written lots of cold mails. I have tried to reach out to universities. I even found out to go to the president's office of the school, the principal's office of the school, just to talk, just to talk. Well, I was refused, but I've tried many creative and crazy approaches. So, I mean, you can choose lots of options. You can go for LinkedIn, you can go for Korean startup who can speak English to work together, or in the other creative ways, you can go to Korean university schools that is looking for co-op programs, startup exchange programs, and say, why don't your marketing to students run a project with us and do this wholesalership project or crowdfunding project with us? Yeah, like you should be really creative when you're approaching the Korean market, since it's a very difficult place to find a partner.
And speaking about finding an employee, this is another question we are quite often asked by startups from Europe, US, and other countries. Koreans and Asian market in general is well known for really good IT guys that are not so expensive as, for example, the ones in Silicon Valley, etc. First of all, is it still true for Korean market? Do you have the huge amount of developers on the market seeking for job and not very costly?
Well, I would say Korean developers are cheaper than your countries, like maybe Europe or North American countries, but expensive than the other Asian countries. So setting up the right price would be quite difficult. And we do have some stereotypes about startups and SMEs in Korea. So it would be very difficult to recruit them just with a fixed paid amount. You would need to add in some other options or incentives. Developers in Korea, developer levels are not really high in Korea. So especially software development. Korea was famous for hardware development for quite a long time. Software, yes, they were quite famous, but in nowadays, like for example, like application developers, web developers, these people are very difficult people to look for. So you might want to cooperate with developing boot camps. There are some, not like maybe Liwegon, it also has a branch in Korea, or other coding boot camps. You should be cooperating with them and look for really good candidates over there. That will be the most safest and easiest way to find the developing HRs.
So it's better not to try reaching out people directly in Facebook when you are hiring a developer, but it's
Yeah.
better to partner up with some local hackathons or hubs, accelerators, etc., and find out there.
Yes, since it's very difficult to find a good developer in Korea, many coding bootcamps cooperate with Google, Amazon branch in Korea. So one of the famous coding bootcamp is Code States. Even I was trying to study over there, but they have a really good internship programs or good partnerships with the corporates for these kind of headhunting for the developers that have studied in there. So they must be open for working with startups as well.
And a few more questions before we finish today. Riso, you mentioned a lot of times about different government programs that really support foreign startups in entering Korean market. They even give money you for living, for building your startup, etc. We will put the links in the description of the major programs that you recommend, but I want to understand better. For example, the startup from Europe or Latin America, early stage startup that, for example, considers launching or moving their technology to Korean market and moving the core team also for living there. So what should they consider while doing this? I mean, first apply to the government program, or first to contact some local partner in order for him to apply in Korean language. What should they do? What are the main steps?
Well, okay, so common mistakes these applicants of these programs make is they don't set up the plan after the program. So this program provides you the best thing this program can provide is that this program provides B2B relationships if you're in the working in the B2B part. So you should take the most out of it. If you don't have the after program plans, then all those assets and time that you have put into would be pointless. So first of all, plan like I mean, I don't really trust in a detailed planning because situation can change anytime. But at least have a brief planning about what you will do with the assets you earn through this program, even though you don't get into the top ranking. So you get extended funding or support from the government. Let's say you ranked at the last, and what are you going to do after the program? You better think. So once you have that planned, then you look for Korean partners. And once you have a really good Korean partner, then you apply for the KSGC programs because it is competitive, but having a Korean partner can provide you contingency plan. So even if you fail from application, you can work with your Korean partner for the next step or the other programs with his name into a local programs, or with his name you can just establish a branch or other activities. So you should have plan A to at least C. So post program plan, before program plan, and the contingency plans. So yeah, those are the things that I would suggest.
Mhm. And what is the chance for foreign startup to obtain this government funding? I mean, every second receives it, or one among 100?
As I remember, every year they select 60 startups around the world, and all the applicants who have made it into the program, they get to receive monthly payment, as I know, with visa supports. And at the end of the program, top 3 or 5 gets to be invested with government funds. And there are accelerators and VCs within the program, so you can also be funded afterwards or during the program, but you don't want to take chances, right?
And just a short question, speaking about the myths about Korean market. I was talking with few entrepreneurs who were working in South Korea for some time in the venture capital industry. And they told me that one more specifics of the Korean market is that their people pay a lot of attention to the appearance. So if you look nice, cute, beautiful, then you will have better chances to establish good business relationship than other way around. It is, they told that this is so concentrated in Korea that you really should pay attention to the appearance. Is it true or not?
Well, I should feel shame about this, but well, that's one of the reasons I chose my co-founder. He's really good looking in a global stand-up.
You will be happy to hear that, you know.
My appearance works better when it goes to negotiation or to foreign relationships, but my co-founder works globally, and it works really good when we get to work with Korean startups or VCs. Appearance, yes, it works. It works. It's not a myth. It's a fact. It's really important. Please don't wear like a Silicon Valley style when you're going for IR in Korea. No, you should always wear suits and ties. Well, you don't need to, but it's better off that way. What other myth? Well, it's not a myth. But as I told you, these VCs are very conservative. You should be very straightforward with your financial statement. You should get really well prepared for your financial statement. How much personal capital you have poured into, and how much revenues you are generating, how many equities you have shared, how you're going to set up this entity in Korea, how many shareholders there is going to be existing. These kind of financial statement, more than your business model. Korean VCs look into that. So good appearance and good looking financial statement is going to thrive your business. That's for sure. Yes.
And how about the need to get drunk with Korean investor? It is also always said that if you can you should invite business partners in Korea to get a drink with you, and then the relationship will develop much faster.
Well, I think it can be applied into most of Asian cultures, not only Korea. This is my personal statistics. At least 3 times of meal, 2 times of coffee, and 3 times of drinking would be needed. It's not mandatory, but in my personal statistics, that amount of time investments were required to properly start discussing the business. So that's one of the reasons cold mail rarely works in Korea. So yeah, that's what I think.
And even pandemic didn't change it a lot yet.
It changed a lot officially, but off the record, it haven't really changed anything. So
okay, that's awesome. Riso, the last question for today. Can you recall maybe 3 major mistakes international foreign startups are making while trying to enter the Korean market? Like, for example, you recalled the Uber case. So 3 major mistakes that we should be aware of and pay attention to.
3. Okay, this
could 5 if there are more.
This could be applied in Korea, but I think this would be applied to many of Asian countries. They underestimate Asian market. Asian market is not easy, especially to set the price, and also during the localization process, their culture, while they have really strong purchasing power than you think. So please don't underestimate when you're going to the foreign market. It has lots of variables, especially relationship issues, cultural issues. And second thing is localization is the most mistakes that foreign startups make. For example, this is the success case. Snapshot was trying to come into Korea, and they did the market testing, and it found that the tendency of Korean customers was not really positive with Snapshot. So Snapshot has changed their business model and the brand at the same time into an application called Snow, which is a camera filtering application, which is based on the original technology of Snapshot, but it was much more appealable to Korean market. So they have made a really good success on their localization tactics. But other reason, Amazon Korea is much more concentrated on AWS than the sales, because Korea already has so many platforms, e-commerce platforms in Korea. So they don't think the competition is going to be easy, but the AWS is totally appealable to Korean market. So these kind of localization tactic was worthwhile looking over. Language logos, you should always check in that market in a qualitative research, please. And also lastly, legal issues. Law is very different. Law in Asian culture is really different. Korean law, if your products are way too innovative, that could also be a problem. So one of the reasons it's tough to find really good innovation in the Asia market is because of the conservative legal systems. So please check once, twice, I don't know how many times you should discuss with Korean lawyers. So for example, there are really innovative technologies and companies in Korea, especially in the healthcare sector. But in Korea, really limited. So these innovative companies has to develop second type of their business model just to survive away from the law and waiting for law to waive these kind of legal limitations. So they're very innovative, legal limitations, making a second plan or side business model. That was their contingency plan. But if you're just launching into a foreign land, not knowing any legal backgrounds, you might get to lose huge amount of your investments. So yeah, check the laws as well. Yeah.
Okay, Riso, thank you much for your advice and so much for your time. You really gave a way better overview of this mysterious but very attractive South Korean market. What I've understood from this discussion actually is that you definitely need a way more preparation than just localizing your interface and putting money into digital advertisement. And therefore you have to find trusted Korean partner in South Korea. And it's not the advertisement, but I highly recommend you to check the link in the description and get in touch with Riso, who can really help you to open the doors, establish relationship, and make this bridge to the Korean market for your startup. 감사합니다 to those who were watching us till the end, and thanks a lot for your Riso. Hope to see you soon in our next videos.
Well, thank you too. Thank you for this great opportunity. Yes, just feel free to reach me out. I'm always happy to help.